Episode 112. Are microplastics being used as a delivery system for chemicals? Welcome back to the Conspiracy Theory Analyst. I'm Robin. They are in your blood, in your brain, in your heart tissue, in the placentas of unborn children, in the peaks of the Himalayas, and in the deepest ocean trenches. Microplastics, tiny fragments of plastic less than 5 millimeters in size, have now been found in virtually every environment and every human body that researchers have looked at. That much is not a conspiracy theory. It is the documented finding of hundreds of peer-reviewed studies across the past decade. What is less settled, and what has moved from the fringes of environmental concern to the agenda of a U.S. congressional hearing in April 2026, is the question of what these particles are actually doing inside us. And a growing body of research, combined with a specific and striking conspiracy theory, raises a question that is harder to dismiss than it once seemed. Are microplastics not just accidental contamination, but a vector, a delivery system, for chemical compounds that accumulate in the body with consequences we are only beginning to understand? Detailed explanation: microplastics are not a single substance. They are fragments of any of the thousands of types of plastic in global use: polyethylene, polypropylene, polystyrene, PET, PVC, and many others. They enter the environment when plastic breaks down under UV radiation, mechanical stress, or chemical processes. They enter the human body through food, water, air, and skin contact. Once inside, they have been found to cross biological barriers that were previously thought to be highly selective, including the blood-brain barrier. A landmark 2025 study published in Nature Medicine confirmed that concentrations of microplastics in human brain tissue increased significantly between 2016 and 2024. A separate April 2025 study found that people who had experienced strokes were more likely to have plastic plaque buildup in their carotid arteries than those who had not. In April 2026, the U.S. Environmental Protection Agency and the Department of Health and Human Services jointly announced that microplastics would be added to the EPA's contaminant candidate list for drinking water, the first time the U.S. government had formally designated them as a priority contaminant. RFK Jr., serving as Secretary of Health and Human Services, launched a $144 million program to study their impact on human health. He described American children as swimming in a toxic soup. The regulatory response is significant not just for what it does, but for what it implies. The U.S. government has been aware of microplastic contamination for years. The decision to act now, and the scale of the investment, reflects a growing official acknowledgement that the health implications may be more serious than previously communicated to the public. Core elements of the theory: the first element is the chemical carrier argument. Microplastics are not chemically inert. They adsorb, attached to their surfaces, a wide range of chemical compounds present in the environment, including persistent organic pollutants, heavy metals, pharmaceutical residues, and endocrine-disrupting chemicals. When microplastics enter the body, they can carry these compounds with them, potentially delivering concentrated doses of harmful substances directly to tissues that would otherwise be protected by normal biological barriers. The conspiracy extension of this documented phenomenon is the suggestion that this delivery mechanism is not entirely accidental, that the combination of ubiquitous plastic use, deliberate chemical formulation, and inadequate regulatory response reflects a system designed to ensure continuous population exposure to compounds with specific biological effects. The second element is the endocrine disruption evidence. Many of the chemical additives used in plastic production, phthalates, bisphenol, flame retardants, are documented endocrine disruptors. They interfere with hormonal signaling in the human body and have been linked to infertility, developmental disruption, metabolic disorders, and immune dysfunction. These chemicals leach from plastics into food, water, and body tissues. The question of whether the scale of their deployment reflects market forces or something more deliberate is one the conspiracy theory asks directly. The third element is the regulatory lag argument. Plastic production has been known to release potentially harmful chemicals for decades. The regulatory response has been slow, fragmented, and critics argue, shaped by industry lobbying. The April 2026 EPA announcement was described by the Plastic Pollution Coalition as falling short of the action needed to protect human health now. For conspiracy believers, the gap between what was known and when action was taken mirrors patterns seen in other industries: tobacco, asbestos, leaded petrol, where manufacturers knew, regulators delayed, and populations bore the cost. The fourth element is the brain accumulation finding. The 2025 Nature Medicine study finding increased microplastic concentrations in human brain tissue across an 8-year period is among the most striking findings in recent environmental health research. The brain is protected by the blood-brain barrier precisely because it is particularly sensitive to foreign substances. The fact that microplastics are crossing it and accumulating in increasing concentrations is, at minimum, a serious public health concern. For those who believe the contamination is not accidental, it represents something more deliberate. Evidence for and against the evidence that microplastics are present in human bodies at increasing concentrations, that they carry harmful chemical compounds, that those compounds have documented health effects, and that the regulatory response has been inadequate relative to the scale of the problem, is now mainstream scientific and governmental acknowledgement. These are not fringe claims. The April 2026 EPA announcement and the $144 million HHS research program represent official confirmation of a serious and growing concern. The evidence for the deliberate conspiracy version that microplastic contamination is intentionally engineered as a population control or chemical delivery mechanism is not established in the documented record. No internal communications, leaked documents, or credible whistleblower accounts have confirmed deliberate design of the contamination system. The scale of plastic production reflects market forces and regulatory failure across decades rather than coordinated intentional harm. What makes the theory compelling is the same thing that makes the tobacco and opioid parallels compelling. In both those cases, the industry knew, the regulators delayed, and the public was exposed while the science was disputed. The pattern does not prove deliberate design, but it establishes that powerful financial interests have previously sustained exactly this kind of pattern when the costs fell on the public rather than on them. Arguments in favor believers argue that the combination of ubiquitous chemical exposure, documented health effects, industry influence over regulation, and the specific finding that microplastics cross the blood-brain barrier and accumulate in increasing concentrations constitutes a system of population-level chemical exposure that is difficult to explain as purely accidental. They point to the documented lobbying by plastic and chemical manufacturers against regulatory action, and argue that the pace of regulatory response is consistent with an industry protecting its interests at public expense. They also note that the April 2026 government response, significant in scale but described by independent health advocates as insufficient, reflects a pattern of acknowledging a problem while limiting the remedial action to what industry interests can accommodate. Arguments against environmental scientists argue that the contamination is the result of decades of market-driven plastic production combined with regulatory frameworks that were not designed to anticipate the scale of the problem. The health effects, while concerning, are still being characterized. The FDA and WHO have both noted that current research has not yet definitively linked typical human exposure to adverse health outcomes, though the evidence is accumulating rapidly. They also note that the conspiracy framing, deliberate design of a chemical delivery system, requires attributing intent to a process that is more parsimoniously explained by market failure and regulatory inadequacy. The outcome may be harmful. That does not require the harm to have been the intention. Public opinion and broader impact, the microplastics issue has undergone a remarkable shift in public consciousness in 2025 and 2026. What was a specialist environmental concern 5 years ago is now a mainstream public health topic, covered by major media and addressed at the highest levels of government. The $144 million HHS research program and the EPA contaminant listing represent a genuine institutional turn. Whether that turn represents genuine protection of public health or a managed acknowledgement that keeps the most significant implications from public view is precisely the question the conspiracy theory asks, and that the evidence does not yet fully answer. Conclusion: are microplastics being used as a delivery system for chemicals? The documented science confirms that they function as one, whether or not that function was designed. They carry harmful compounds into human bodies, cross biological barriers, including the blood-brain barrier, and accumulate in increasing concentrations in tissue. The regulatory response has been slower than the scientific evidence justified. For believers, the pattern, known harm, delayed regulation, industry influence, population-wide exposure, reflects deliberate design rather than accident. For scientists and regulators, it reflects market failure and the familiar gap between what science discovers and what institutions are willing to act on. What is certain is this: microplastics are in your brain. Concentrations are rising. The government declared a priority in April 2026. And the question of what they are doing there has not yet been fully answered. This is the Conspiracy Theory Analyst. I'm Robin. If tonight's episode made you think, please rate and follow on Spotify. Tomorrow on the Conspiracy Theory Analyst, the Flat Earth Theory. Who believes it and why won't it die? That's next.